When I died, my body lay in the heat of a Babylonian summer for 6 full days without showing any sign of decay. No odor, no discoloration, nothing. My soldiers, the men who had followed me from Macedonia to the edges of the known world, believed it was proof that I was a god. Modern medicine has a different explanation, one that is in some ways more disturbing than the divine. But that is how my story ends. Let me tell you how it began. I am Alexander III of Macedon, son of King Philip II and Queen Olympias, King of Macedonia, Pharaoh of Egypt, King of Persia, Lord of Asia, conqueror of the known world. I was born in the summer of the year 356 before Christ in Pella, the capital of Macedonia, a kingdom that the great city-states of Greece regarded as a semi-barbaric backwater, populated by rough northern warriors who could barely claim to be truly Greek. That contempt was something I spent my entire life proving wrong, and then surpassing, and then leaving so far behind that the men who had looked down on Macedonia had to look up at what Macedonia had become. My father, Philip II, was one of the most brilliant military and political minds of his age, a fact that history has consistently undervalued because I overshadowed him so completely. He transformed Macedonia from a fragile kingdom constantly threatened by its neighbors into the dominant military power in the Greek world. He reorganized the Macedonian army, invented the tactical formation that would become the foundation of my own conquests, built alliances with extraordinary patience and cunning, and unified Greece under Macedonian leadership through a combination of force and diplomacy that no previous ruler had managed. I was his son, and I learned everything from watching him. And then I surpassed him in ways that I think both thrilled and troubled him in equal measure. My mother Olympias was a very different kind of influence. She was a princess of Epirus, deeply religious, intensely passionate, and possessed of a personal intensity that frightened most people who encountered her. She was devoted to the mystery cults of Dionysus, and she raised me with an absolute conviction that my destiny was not merely royal, but divine. She told me from childhood that my true father was not Philip, but Zeus himself, that the king of the gods had visited her in the form of a serpent before my birth. Whether she believed this literally or used it as a political tool to elevate my status, the effect on me was the same. I grew up genuinely uncertain about where the boundary between the human and the divine lay in my own nature, and that uncertainty drove me toward horizons that a man who knew his limits would never have approached. When I was 13 years old, my father did something that shaped the entire course of my intellectual life. He hired Aristotle to be my tutor, not a capable teacher, not a respected scholar. Aristotle, the man who was already recognized in his own lifetime as the greatest mind in the Greek world, the student of Plato, the man who had thought more systematically and more deeply about more subjects than any human being before him. For 3 years, Aristotle taught me philosophy, medicine, science, rhetoric, logic, and literature. He gave me a copy of the Iliad annotated in his own hand. I kept that copy with me for the rest of my life, sleeping with it under my pillow alongside a dagger. Homer's Achilles was my model, my obsession, the standard against which I measured every action I ever took. Achilles chose a short life of immortal glory over a long life of comfortable obscurity. From the age of 13, I knew which choice I would make if given the same option. There is a story from my youth that reveals something essential about who I was. When I was around 16, my father was away on campaign, and a group of Thessalian horse traders brought a magnificent black stallion to the Macedonian court to sell. The horse was so wild and so dangerous that no one could ride it. Philip's best horsemen tried and were thrown. Philip was about to send the horse away when I spoke up and said I could ride it. My father looked at me with the particular expression of a man who is simultaneously proud and irritated by his son. He asked what I would do if I failed. I said I would pay the price of the horse myself. He agreed. I had noticed something no one else had seen. The horse was terrified of its own shadow. I turned it to face the sun so its shadow fell behind it, calmed it with my voice, and mounted it. I rode it across the plain at full gallop and came back to a court that stood in complete silence. My father had tears in his eyes. He told me that Macedonia was too small for me and that I would have to find a larger kingdom. The horse was Bucephalus. He carried me to the ends of the earth and died in battle in India at the age of 30, and I founded a city there in his name. My relationship with my father became increasingly complicated as I grew older and as his political decisions began to conflict directly with my position as his heir. When Philip married a Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra, not the Egyptian queen, but a local aristocrat, the political implication was clear. If she produced a son, that son would have a stronger claim to the Macedonian throne than I did, because his blood would be purely Macedonian, rather than half Epirot through my mother. At the wedding feast, the bride's uncle made a toast expressing the hope for a legitimate heir to Macedonia. I threw my cup at him and demanded to know what he thought I was. My father drew his sword and came at me, drunk, and fell over a piece of furniture before he could reach me. I looked at him on the floor and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, that this was the man who was going to cross from Europe into Asia, but could not make it from one couch to another. I left that night with my mother and spent months in exile before a reconciliation was arranged. My father was killed in 336 before Christ, stabbed by one of his own bodyguards at a celebration in the theater at Ege. The assassin was cut down immediately, so his full motivations were never established. There have always been whispers that my mother was involved, that she had orchestrated the removal of the husband who had humiliated her and threatened her son's inheritance. I have never known the full truth of that. What I knew was that at 20 years old, I was suddenly king of Macedonia, heir to an empire my father had built, and surrounded by enemies on every side who believed that a young king was a weak king, and that the moment of transition was the moment to strike. They were wrong. Within 2 years, I had crushed every rebellion in Greece, destroyed the city of Thebes so completely as a warning to anyone else considering resistance, secured my northern borders through a lightning campaign that left my enemies speechless with its speed, and was ready to do what my father had only planned, cross into Asia and take on the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire at that time was the largest political entity the world had ever seen. It stretched from the eastern Mediterranean to the borders of India, encompassing dozens of nations, hundreds of languages, and a military force of almost incomprehensible size. I crossed into Asia in 334 before Christ with approximately 47,000 men. I left Macedonia with enough money in the treasury to supply my army for approximately 30 days. Everything after that would have to be taken from the enemy. If I failed, there was no reserve, no fallback, no rescue. I burned the boats. Not literally, but the financial reality was the same. There was only forward. What would you have done in that moment? Standing on the Asian shore with 47,000 men, looking at an empire that had humiliated Greece for 2 centuries, that had burned Athens and enslaved entire populations, knowing that you had enough supplies for 1 month and that every general in the known world would have told you the odds were impossible. Would you have hesitated? Because I did not hesitate for a single breath. I threw my spear into Asian soil the moment we landed, claiming the continent as territory won by the spear. And then we moved. The campaign that followed over the next 11 years is unlike anything else in the military history of the ancient world. At the Granicus River, my first major battle against Persian forces, I nearly died in the opening moments of the fighting. A Persian cavalry commander named Spithridates had his sword raised above my head when my companion Clytus the Black cut off Spithridates' arm and saved my life. I never forgot that debt, which makes what happened between Clytus and me years later in Samarkand one of the most painful chapters of my entire story. At Issus, I faced the Persian great king Darius III himself in battle for the first time, with a force that was vastly outnumbered, and broke his army so completely that Darius fled the battlefield in his chariot, abandoning his mother, his wife, his daughters, and his entire treasury. I treated his captured family with complete courtesy, visiting his mother Sisigambis personally and telling her that she had not lost a son but gained one. She wept and treated me as a son for the rest of her life. Egypt welcomed me without significant resistance. The Persians had been deeply unpopular rulers there, and I was received as a liberator. The priests of Amun at the oracle of Siwa in the western desert confirmed what my mother had always told me, that I was of divine origin, the son of Amun, the Egyptian god who corresponded to Zeus. I emerged from that consultation with the oracle having heard something that I never repeated to anyone. Not a single account records what the oracle actually told me. I carried whatever it said to my death. At Gaugamela in 331 before Christ, I faced Darius again with his largest assembled force, an army that ancient sources describe in numbers ranging from 200,000 to 1 million men. I had approximately 47,000. I won. Darius fled again, and this time was stabbed to death by his own nobles before I could reach him. I found his body by the roadside and covered it with my own cloak. He had been the great king of Persia. He deserved to be treated as one, even in death. There is someone I have not yet told you about, and I cannot tell my story honestly without telling you about him. His name was Hephaestion. He was my closest companion, my dearest friend, the person who knew me more completely than any other human being alive. We had grown up together, studied under Aristotle together, and from the moment I began my campaign in Asia, he was always at my side, sharing my tent, my counsel, my plans, and my grief. The ancient world understood our bond as something that went beyond friendship in the way that most people use that word. When a Persian dignitary at the captured court mistakenly addressed Hephaestion rather than me as the king, Hephaestion stepped aside, and the dignitary was mortified with embarrassment. I told him not to worry. Hephaestion, I said, was also Alexander. That is the most revealing thing I ever said about what he meant to me. I pushed east beyond Persia into Bactria and Sogdia, the territories of modern Afghanistan and Central Asia, where I fought some of the hardest and most grueling campaigns of my entire career against guerrilla forces that used the mountains and deserts with a skill that no pitched battle training prepared us for. It was in Bactria that I married Roxana, the daughter of a local chieftain, a genuinely unconventional choice that shocked my Macedonian officers who had expected a politically useful Greek or Persian bride. I married her because I chose to. That was the only reason I ever needed for anything. It was also in those Eastern campaigns that I did something I have never fully made peace with, even in memory. At a banquet in Samarkand, drunk on wine after a long night of celebration, my old friend and savior Clytus, the man who had cut off a Persian sword arm above my head at the Granicus and saved my life, said things in his drunkenness that cut through the wine and the noise and reached something raw in me. He criticized my decision to adopt Persian customs. He implied that my victories were due to the soldiers rather than their king. He invoked my father's name in a way that was designed to diminish me. Something broke in me in that moment. I grabbed a spear from a guard and drove it through Clytus before anyone could stop me. He was dead before he hit the floor. I stood there looking at what I had done, and the grief and horror of it hit me so completely that I collapsed over his body and had to be pulled away. I refused to eat or drink for 3 days. No one could reach me. The man who had never wept in battle wept for days over a friend he had ended with his own hand in a moment of rage he could not take back. I pushed further east than any Greek or Macedonian had ever gone, crossing into India and defeating King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes River in a campaign that military historians still study as one of the most tactically innovative battles in ancient history. Porus fought with war elephants in numbers I had never faced before, and I adapted my tactics on the ground in real time to overcome them. When Porus was brought before me after the battle, wounded and captured, I asked him how he wished to be treated. He said, "As a king." I returned his kingdom to him and made him my ally. It was the response I would have given in his position, and I respected him for it completely. But at the Hyphasis River, the furthest point of my advance, something happened that had never happened before in 11 years of campaigning. My army refused to go further. They had been marching and fighting for over a decade. They were exhausted, homesick, and looking at the prospect of campaigns stretching indefinitely further into an unknown continent. My generals, led by Conus, spoke for the army in terms that were respectful but absolutely firm. They would go no further east. I went to my tent and stayed there for 3 days in the hope that the army's resolve would weaken. It did not. For the first and only time in my life, I turned around because others would not follow. I wept, and I built 12 enormous altars on the banks of that river to mark the furthest point I reached. I never stopped wanting to go further. The march back west through the Gedrosian desert was the darkest chapter of my campaign. I chose a route through one of the most hostile environments on Earth, partly for strategic reasons, and partly, I think, to prove something to myself that the army's refusal at the Hyphasis had shaken. Thousands died in that desert, from thirst, from heat, from exhaustion. Men and women who had survived 10 years of warfare against the most formidable enemies in the world died in a desert on the way home. It was a cost I carry. I returned to Babylon in 323 before Christ, planning new campaigns. Arabia was next, then perhaps west, toward Carthage and beyond. In June of that year, after a banquet, I fell ill. Over the following days, the illness progressed with a speed and severity that my physicians could not stop. I lost the ability to speak. I lost the ability to move. When my soldiers, fearing I was already gone, demanded to see me alive, I was carried to the doorway of my chamber, and I greeted them one by one in silence, moving only my eyes and my hand. On the 11th of June, in 323 before Christ, I died in Babylon. I was 32 years old. I had never lost a battle. The cause of my death has been debated for over 2,000 years. Poison, suggested by some ancient sources, is the explanation that has never been fully ruled out. Typhoid fever, complicated by other factors, is what many modern historians favor. But the detail that has haunted every discussion of my death is this. My body showed no signs of decay for 6 full days after I died. No odor, no discoloration, in the heat of a Babylonian summer. My soldiers took it as confirmation of what they had always half believed, that I was something more than mortal. Modern medical researchers have proposed an explanation that is in some ways more unsettling than divinity. They suggest I may have suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, a condition that can cause a state of paralysis so complete that it mimics death while the person is still technically alive. If that theory is correct, I was not dead when they thought I was dead. I was aware, unable to speak or move, watching from within a body that could no longer respond. Whether that is more or less comforting than the divine explanation, I leave for you to decide. Hephaestion had died 8 months before me, in Ecbatana, from an illness that took him in days. My grief at his death was something that shocked even those who knew me well. I lay beside his body for a day and a night, refusing to leave. I had the physician who treated him executed. I ordered a period of mourning across the empire and commissioned a funeral monument of such size and ambition that it was never completed. I cut my hair, which among the Greeks was the gesture of deepest mourning, something Achilles had done for Patroclus in the Iliad that had shaped my entire understanding of what it meant to love someone. Without Hephaestion, I was already diminished in ways that no territory or victory could address. I wonder sometimes, in the way that the dead perhaps wonder about things, whether I would have survived much longer, even if Babylon had not taken me. My body was placed in a golden sarcophagus and eventually taken to Alexandria in Egypt, the greatest of the cities I had founded, where it was displayed in a magnificent tomb. Julius Caesar visited it and wept. Augustus Caesar visited it and accidentally broke off the nose of my mummified body. And then, at some point in the chaos of the late Roman Empire, my tomb was lost. It has never been found. The greatest conqueror in the history of the ancient world lies somewhere beneath the modern city of Alexandria, and despite centuries of searching, no one knows exactly where. And now I want to ask you something that I have wondered about for over 2,000 years. I conquered the known world before I was 33 years old, founded cities that still exist today, spread Greek language and culture across 3 continents in a transformation that historians call the Hellenistic Age, and died before I could do what I was already planning next. Was it enough? Was 32 years of that kind of living worth more than 80 years of something smaller? I made my choice at 13 when I first read about Achilles. I am curious whether you would have made the same one. I am Alexander. Alexander the Great. The boy from a kingdom Greece looked down on who went on to conquer Greece, Persia, Egypt, and the edges of India before the world was ready to stop him. And although my tomb lies hidden beneath a modern city that bears my name, here I remain. In the layout of every city that followed the grid pattern I established in Alexandria. In the Greek words that filtered into Persian and Arabic and Hindi through the world I connected. In every person who has ever looked at a horizon and felt that the only honest response was to move toward it, without knowing what waited on the other side. The boy who tamed Bucephalus by turning him to face the sun never stopped looking for the next thing that everyone else said could not be done, and neither should you.